Midnight lingered reluctantly within the vast ancestral manor, where candles had burned low after hours of celebration and music. The corridors were hushed, yet not peaceful. Whispers drifted like restless moths between the walls. Servants moved softly, trading glances heavy with unspoken speculation, for something within the bridal chamber had gone strangely amiss. Inside, the room still glowed with the frail gold of dwindling firelight. Lace curtains stirred faintly against tall windows, and rose petals from the evening's festivities lay crushed upon the carpet. The bride sat upright on the edge of the bed, her ivory nightgown folded neatly around her stillness. She had not wept. Her eyes were dry, wide, and stunned in a manner that felt far more fragile than tears. Beside her, her husband slept deeply, one arm cast carelessly across the coverlet, his breath slow and untroubled. The contrast struck her with quiet cruelty. Only moments earlier, in that thoughtless drift between wakefulness and dream, he had murmured a name with unmistakable tenderness. Her sister's name. Not loud, not dramatic. Merely breathed with familiarity, as though spoken countless times before in the privacy of his mind. She had not moved when she heard it. For several seconds she had wondered if she herself had imagined the sound, if her mind, already weary from ceremony and expectation, had fashioned a phantom cruelty. But then he had repeated it, softer, almost fondly, before settling into deeper sleep. In that instant, something delicate and unseen within her gave way without protest. The chamber felt altered, as though the air itself had shifted allegiance. The flowers smelled too sweet, the fire too warm, the bed too wide. She rose carefully, ensuring the mattress did not dip beneath her movement, and stood barefoot upon the carpet strewn with petals meant to celebrate a union that now felt like a polite arrangement built upon a misunderstanding of the heart. She crossed to the mirror and regarded her reflection in the low light. Her dark hair had been loosened from its formal arrangement, falling in gentle waves about her shoulders. She looked not like a bride, but like a woman who had awakened from a dream she had mistaken for certainty. Memories arrived unbidden. Childhood afternoons and drawing rooms where visitors praised her sister's brightness and charm. Gentle comparisons offered as compliments that never felt kind. The way she had learned to occupy corners gracefully, to listen more than speak, to accept admiration only when it arrived by accident. Even her courtship had unfolded with similar quietness. He had been attentive, courteous, thoughtful. Yet never once had he spoken with the fevered certainty she had seen men display toward other women. She had mistaken steadiness for devotion. Tonight had corrected her. The fire gave a soft sigh as a log shifted into ash. That small sound seemed to grant her permission to act. She moved to the bedside table and removed her wedding ring with steady fingers. For a brief moment, the cool circle of gold rested in her palm, catching the last glow of flame. Then she placed it gently beside the dying fire, where morning light would find it without effort. She dressed without haste, choosing a simple traveling gown from the wardrobe rather than the elaborate garments prepared for her new life. Each button fastened felt like a quiet declaration. Each fold of fabric drawn into place restored a fragment of her dignity. She did not look toward the bed again. The corridor beyond the chamber was dim and silent. Portraits of long-departed ancestors watched her passage with indifferent solemnity. Somewhere far below, a clock marked the hour with patient authority. She descended the staircase without a candle, guided by memory and resolve. At the foot of the stairs, she encountered the lady of the house. His mother stood near the entrance hall window, wrapped in a dark shawl, as though she had been waiting for a truth she already suspected. Her face, lined with experience and intelligence, took in the bride's travel attire, the absence of jewelry, the composed expression that betrayed nothing and everything at once. Neither woman spoke immediately. Understanding passed between them with painful clarity. The older woman's eyes softened, not with pity but with respect. She stepped aside without question, creating a path toward the door. Only when the bride reached for the handle did the mother speak, her voice low and measured. "My dear," she said quietly, "a woman should never remain where her heart is not called by name." The words settled gently into the bride's chest, not as comfort but as affirmation. She inclined her head in gratitude she could not voice and stepped out into the pre-dawn mist. Cold air met her cheeks like a baptism. The world beyond the manor was wrapped in silver fog, the gravel path glistening faintly beneath lantern light. A waiting carriage, ordered earlier under the pretense of precaution, stood ready at the gates. The driver, half asleep and unsuspecting, straightened at her approach. She did not look back. As the carriage rolled away, the manor faded into pale obscurity behind her, its towers dissolving into the morning haze. Only then did her breath tremble. Not from sorrow, but from the enormity of what she had done. She had left not in anger, not in scandal, but in preservation of something too delicate to survive humiliation. Upstairs, the husband stirred as dawn filtered gently through lace curtains. He reached across the bed for warmth and found only cool emptiness. His eyes opened slowly, confusion knitting his brow. He called her name once, lightly, as though expecting her to answer from the dressing room. Silence replied. He sat up. The room appeared unchanged, yet subtly wrong. The petals on the floor. The faint smell of extinguished fire. The absence of her presence, which he had not realized was so tangible until it vanished. Then he saw the ring, resting beside the ashes. A peculiar chill traveled through him as understanding arrived not in thought, but in sensation. He rose quickly, calling for servants, demanding explanations no one could give. Panic sharpened his voice in ways unfamiliar even to himself. His mother entered the chamber without haste. She regarded the abandoned ring, the disordered bed, and finally her son's pale expression. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, with a calm that carried the weight of judgment and wisdom alike, she spoke the words that would echo within him long after the room fell silent. "You fool," she said softly. "You have mistaken affection for love, and now you shall learn the cost." He stared at her, bewildered, as the truth began to arrange itself into dreadful clarity. Somewhere beyond the fog-shrouded hills, his bride was already disappearing from his life, carrying with her a dignity he had not known how to honor, and a heart he had never truly understood until the moment he lost it. By the third morning after her disappearance, the manor no longer felt like a house but a question left unanswered. Servants moved with exaggerated quiet, as though noise itself might offend the absence she had created. Footsteps were softened, doors closed with care, and conversations dissolved when he entered a room. The celebration flowers had begun to wilt in their vases, drooping like witnesses reluctant to testify. He noticed these things with an irritation that concealed something far more fragile beneath it. He sent for her at once, convinced she had retreated to her family home in a fit of wounded pride. A carriage was dispatched before breakfast, instructions given with strained authority. When the driver returned alone by afternoon, the first crack appeared in his certainty. She had not arrived there. Her father had received no letter, her sister offered no explanation, and the household stood perplexed by her absence. London learned of it before the week had ended. Drawing rooms hummed with delicate speculation disguised as sympathy. Invitations addressed to her were quietly withdrawn, and her name floated through conversations like perfume that lingered too long. Some pitied her. Others admired what they assumed was dramatic temperament, never suspecting the quiet courage behind her departure. He tried to resume his routines, but each task felt absurdly trivial beside the mystery of her silence. Her empty chair at breakfast accused him without sound. He found himself listening for her footstep in corridors, then resenting the foolish hope. That night, unable to endure stillness, he began sending tokens. Small, thoughtful offerings that once would have pleased her deeply. He ordered her favorite pressed violets arranged in delicate paper and sent by courier. They returned unopened. He selected a volume of poetry she had often read beside the window and dispatched it with a letter. It came back untouched. He sent a small music box that played the melody she once hummed absent-mindedly while sewing. It too returned, politely refused. With every parcel that reappeared at the manor gates, his composure thinned further. What he had believed was temporary distance now resembled deliberate severance. He began to ask questions quietly, employing discretion rather than authority. Servants spoke to acquaintances, acquaintances to coachmen, coachmen to innkeepers. Gradually, a faint trail appeared where none had seemed possible. She had been seen traveling north in a modest hired carriage under her maiden name. She had disembarked near a small coastal town known more for winds than society. And there, astonishingly, she had taken a position as governess for a widowed merchant's children. He read the report twice, disbelieving not the facts but what they implied about her resolve. The journey to the coast felt longer than any he remembered, though the roads were familiar. Rain accompanied him most of the way, blurring hedgerows into streaks of green and gray. He traveled without crest or announcement, preferring anonymity to dignity. For the first time, he wished to approach her not as husband, but as a man seeking forgiveness. He saw her before she saw him. She stood in a modest garden behind a whitewashed cottage, reading aloud to two children seated at her feet. The sea wind tugged gently at loose strands of her dark hair. She wore a plain dress, sleeves rolled slightly, expression calm and patient. In that quiet scene he realized he had never truly seen her before. He remained beyond the gate for several minutes, watching the life she had constructed without him. There was no trace of bitterness in her posture, only self-possession. The children laughed at something she said, and the sound struck him with unexpected force. He understood then that her departure had not been an escape, but a reclamation. Rain began again, softly at first, then with steadier insistence. The children hurried indoors at her urging, leaving her momentarily alone in the garden. She turned toward the cottage door, and her gaze lifted unexpectedly to the gate. Their eyes met across the narrow distance. Neither moved immediately, as though the air between them required careful negotiation. His hand rested upon the damp wood of the gate, uncertain whether to push or retreat. She did not appear startled, only very still, as if she had expected this moment eventually. The rain darkened the earth between them, tapping softly against leaves like a patient clock. He removed his hat slowly, an instinctive gesture of respect rather than habit. For a heartbeat, he forgot every rehearsed apology prepared during the journey. All that remained was the undeniable awareness of what he had nearly destroyed through carelessness. She stepped closer to the gate without speaking, her composure intact yet undeniably altered by his presence. The distance between them shortened to something intimate and unbearable. He noticed the faint shadows beneath her eyes, signs of nights spent thinking rather than sleeping. "I came to return what I failed to honor," he said quietly, voice roughened by humility. She did not answer, but her gaze lowered briefly to his empty hands. The absence of gifts seemed to confuse her, as though she had expected another token. "I wish to see you as you are," he continued, "not as I foolishly assumed." A fragile silence followed, heavy with everything unsaid between them. The rain softened to a mist, blurring the edges of the world beyond the garden. She studied his face as though searching for evidence of the man she had once trusted. Whatever she found there did not prompt anger, only a weary recognition. Behind her, the cottage door creaked softly in the wind, reminding them both of the life waiting within. He realized with sudden clarity that she belonged to herself now, not to him. His fingers tightened slightly on the gate as courage gathered painfully in his chest. He drew a slow breath. She lifted the latch before he could speak again, opening the way between them with quiet deliberation that felt less like forgiveness, more like the beginning of reckoning. The cottage interior held the gentle warmth of a place shaped by modest routines rather than grand expectation. A small fire whispered within the hearth, and the scent of drying lavender lingered in the air. Rain tapped patiently against the narrow windows, enclosing the room in a private stillness that felt both intimate and inescapable. She gestured toward a simple wooden chair, and he removed his gloves with careful deliberation before sitting, as though sudden movements might fracture the fragile civility between them. She remained standing for a moment, hands folded lightly before her, studying him with composed restraint. The plainness of her surroundings seemed to dignify her rather than diminish her. There were no silks, no chandeliers, no ancestral portraits observing from gilded frames. Only whitewashed walls, a worn rug, and the steady pulse of the sea wind beyond the cottage. "I trust your journey was not uncomfortable," she said at last, her voice measured and formal. "It was deserved," he replied quietly. A faint flicker passed through her eyes, not quite approval, not quite reproach. She seated herself opposite him, leaving a small table between them like an agreed boundary neither wished to cross prematurely. For several breaths, they listened to the fire settle and the rain persist, each sound filling the spaces words hesitated to enter. "I owe you an apology beyond language," he began, fingers interlaced to steady their slight tremor. "What I did was thoughtless, cruel, and unforgivable." "You did not act," she said gently. "You revealed." The distinction struck him with more force than accusation could have achieved. He lowered his gaze, accepting the precision of her observation. "All my life," she continued, "I have stood beside my sister and been mistaken for her shadow. I believed marriage would grant me a place where I was seen distinctly. That night proved I had carried my shadow with me." He looked up quickly, startled by the absence of bitterness in her tone. It was not anger she offered, but clarity sharpened by long endurance. "I admired her once," he admitted carefully. "In youth, when admiration requires little understanding. But what I felt for you was different, quieter, and I mistook its gentleness for lesser value. Only in losing you did I recognize its depth." She studied his face with thoughtful scrutiny, searching perhaps for traces of self-deception. The firelight moved softly across her features, illuminating the calm dignity he had overlooked for so long. You speak now with certainty, she said. But certainty arrived only after I departed. Yes, he answered without hesitation. And that is my shame. Silence followed, not hostile but contemplative. Outside, the wind shifted direction, brushing the cottage walls like a restless hand. He realized he had never before sat with her in such honest stillness. Their previous conversations had been polite exchanges within crowded rooms, diluted by society's expectations. I will not return, she said quietly. The words fell between them with finality, yet her voice trembled almost imperceptibly at their edges. I will not be loved as an afterthought, nor accepted as consolation for a mistake. I would rather remain here, unknown and unremarked, than resume a life built upon comparison. He leaned forward slightly, restrained by her composure from any dramatic gesture. You were never a comparison to me, he said earnestly. You were the calm in every room I entered, the mind I trusted most, the presence I sought without realizing why. I was a fool too comfortable in habit to recognize devotion when it stood quietly before me. Her eyes glistened briefly, though no tear escaped. The vulnerability in that moment felt more intimate than any embrace. Do you know what wounded me most? She asked softly. He shook his head. It was not the name itself, she said. It was the tenderness with which you spoke it. That tenderness should have belonged to me. He closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the truth of her words like a necessary wound. I cannot undo that moment, he said. But I can spend the rest of my life ensuring no such doubt ever touches you again. She rose then, moving to the hearth to adjust the fire with small, deliberate motions. The act gave her time to gather herself without his gaze upon her. When she turned back, her composure had returned fully. You ask for trust, she said, yet trust cannot be requested. It must be rebuilt quietly, without expectation of reward. I am prepared for that, he replied. She regarded him for a long moment, then nodded slightly as though acknowledging his sincerity without granting its success. You should return before nightfall, she said. The roads grow difficult in darkness. He stood reluctantly, sensing the conversation had reached a boundary neither could cross today. He gathered his gloves, hesitating as though something remained unsaid. I will not trouble you further, he promised. But I will not abandon hope either. She did not answer. Instead, she walked him to the door, where the rain had softened into a fine mist. The gray light outside rendered the world quiet and suspended, as if time itself waited to see what would unfold next. He stepped out into the damp air and paused, turning back toward her with a look that carried apology, admiration, and longing in equal measure. Goodbye, he said gently. Goodbye, she replied. The door closed between them with a soft, final sound. He stood for a moment on the path, gathering the resolve to leave. Then he walked away without looking back, respecting the dignity she guarded so fiercely. Inside, she remained by the door long after his footsteps faded. Only when the cottage settled into silence did she notice something resting upon the small table where he had sat. A narrow ribbon of pale blue silk. And threaded upon it her wedding ring. Morning arrived with a pale, deliberate light that filtered through the cottage windows and rested upon the small table like a quiet witness. She stood before it for a long time, the blue ribbon and gold ring undisturbed where she had found them. The fire had burned to embers during the night, yet the room felt strangely warm, as though memory itself radiated heat. She touched the ribbon at last, not lifting it, only confirming that it was real and not imagined tenderness. A folded letter lay beneath the ring. She recognized his handwriting instantly, the familiar slant that once addressed invitations and notes of polite affection. For several moments she did not open it. The weight of what might be written felt heavier than the paper itself. Finally, with a steady breath, she unfolded the page. There were no excuses, no elaborate defenses, only a careful confession of his failure to understand his own heart until it had cost him something irreplaceable. He wrote not of love in grand declarations, but of small memories, the way she listened when others spoke, the calm she carried into every crowded room, the comfort he had taken for granted because it never demanded attention. He ended with a single line written more firmly than the rest. I spoke the wrong name once. Allow me the rest of my life to speak yours with reverence. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lowered the letter. The words did not command forgiveness, yet they stirred something she had tried diligently to quiet. She threaded the ribbon slowly through her hands, feeling the smooth silk slide across her skin, and wondered whether dignity required her to ignore what her heart still recognized. That afternoon, the village gathered in the small square near the chapel for a charity fair benefiting families of fishermen lost at sea. Tables were arranged with homemade preserves, knitted scarves and baskets of bread. Children ran freely between stalls while women conversed in gentle clusters. She attended as she always did, offering her help without seeking notice. A subtle murmur began near the edge of the crowd, spreading like ripples through water. She sensed it before she saw the cause. Conversations quieted. Faces turned toward the road. He had arrived. Not in fine carriage, not with the display of wealth or title, but on horseback, coat damp from travel, hat in hand. He dismounted slowly, aware that every eye watched his approach. The villagers recognized at once that this was no ordinary visitor. The weight of his presence unsettled the comfortable rhythm of the afternoon. She stood behind a small table of baked goods, hands resting lightly upon the wood as he walked toward her. Each step he took seemed to challenge the expectations of everyone present. This was not the place for a man of his standing to conduct private affairs, yet he came without hesitation. They faced one another in the open air, with witnesses on every side. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice clear enough for those nearest to hear. "Good afternoon," she replied, her composure unbroken though her pulse quickened. He did not speak quietly. He did not request privacy. Instead, he addressed her with a steadiness that carried beyond them both. "I have wronged this woman," he said, turning slightly so others could hear. "Not through cruelty of intent, but through blindness of heart. I mistook familiarity for love and nearly lost the one person whose presence gave my life its true comfort." A hush settled over the square. Even the children grew still. She stared at him, astonished by the boldness of his confession. Victorian society did not favor public vulnerability, yet he stood unguarded before strangers. "I ask no immediate forgiveness," he continued. "Only the chance to prove in action rather than words, that my devotion is no longer clouded by foolishness." A breeze lifted the edges of her dress as she struggled to reconcile the man before her with the one who had wounded her so deeply. He was not pleading for sympathy, nor attempting to restore his pride. He was surrendering both. "I spoke the wrong name once," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. "Allow me now to spend a lifetime speaking yours with reverence." The words, identical to those in the letter, carried a different weight when spoken aloud. They hung in the air between them, undeniable and sincere. The crowd watched in rapt silence, aware they were witnessing something far more intimate than gossip. This was not scandal. It was humility laid bare. Her heart wavered dangerously between caution and longing. She had left to protect her dignity, to preserve the part of herself that refused to be second to anyone. Yet here he stood, placing her first before the eyes of an entire village. She stepped away from the table slowly, the space between them closing with measured grace. Every footstep felt like a negotiation between pride and hope. She stopped only an arm's length from him, close enough to see the uncertainty he tried valiantly to hide. "You place me in a difficult position, sir," she said quietly, though her voice carried. "I know," he answered. "You ask me to trust what was once broken." "Yes. And you do so before witnesses, leaving me no retreat into quiet refusal." A faint, rueful smile touched his lips. "I wished you to know I no longer hide my heart." She studied him for a long moment that seemed to stretch beyond time. Then, without speaking further, she reached into the pocket of her dress. When her hand emerged, the pale blue ribbon lay across her palm, the gold ring glinting softly in the afternoon light. A collective breath passed through the watching crowd. She held his gaze as she lifted the ribbon slightly, not yet offering it, not yet withdrawing it. The decision hovered visibly between them, fragile and monumental. And in that suspended moment, every whisper of the past and every possibility of the future balanced upon the small circle of gold trembling gently in her hand. If you like my content, don't forget to subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and share your thoughts in the comments.